There's a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when everything changes. No arguments, no dramatic exits, no final warning, just silence. And most people misunderstand that silence. They think it means space. They think it means confusion. They think, give it time, they'll come back. But what they don't see is what happened before the quiet. They didn't see the conversations that went unheard. They didn't feel the effort that went unappreciated. They didn't notice the emotional exhaustion building layer by layer. Because when an empath finally goes quiet, it's not sudden. It's the result of being loud in all the ways that mattered and still not being heard. That silence. It's not a pause. It's a decision made after giving too much, caring too deeply, and staying longer than most ever would. And by the time you notice it, the empath is already gone, mentally, emotionally, and soon completely. So today, we're going to understand that moment, what it really means, why it happens, and why, once an empath reaches that point, there's rarely anything left to fix. Silence is often misunderstood, especially when it comes from someone who has always been emotionally present, expressive, and deeply invested. When an empath becomes quiet, most people assume something is wrong in the moment, but the truth is that silence is not a reaction, it's a resolution. It's the final stage of a long internal process that has already taken place. An empath doesn't arrive at silence quickly. In fact, they resist it for as long as they can. Their natural instinct is to communicate, to understand, and to repair. When something feels off, they don't ignore it, lean in. They ask questions. They try to see things from every angle. They give chances not because they're naive, but because they believe in emotional depth and human complexity. They assume that if they can just express themselves clearly enough, things can improve. But over time, a pattern begins to form. They notice that their words don't lead to change. Their concerns are minimized, dismissed, or turned back on them. What they thought was a conversation becomes a cycle, one where they give more and more, but receive less and less in return. Still, they don't give up immediately. They adjust their approach. They become more patient. They try different ways of explaining how they feel, hoping something will finally connect. This is where most people misunderstand the empath's tolerance. It's not that they don't see the problem, it's that they keep hoping the other person will. They're not blind to the imbalance, they're just invested in fixing it. But every time their effort goes unreciprocated, something shifts internally. It's subtle at first, a little less enthusiasm, a little less emotional availability, a little more hesitation before opening up again, and this shift is critical because it marks the beginning of emotional withdrawal. The empath starts to realize that continuing to give at the same level is no longer sustainable, not because they've run out of care, but because they've run out of assurance that their care matters. That's a very different kind of exhaustion. It's not physical, it's emotional depletion caused by repeated disappointment. Eventually, they reach a point where they stop initiating the same conversations. They stop revisiting the same unresolved issues. Not because those issues are resolved, but because they've accepted that resolution may never come. And this acceptance is what leads to silence. So when an empath goes quiet, it's not an impulsive act. It's not driven by anger or an attempt to manipulate. It's driven by clarity. They've assessed the situation, recognized the pattern, and made a decision, often without announcing it. This is what makes their silence so powerful and, for many, so surprising. Because externally it can look like they've simply pulled back, but internally they've already let go. They've already processed the disappointment, the frustration, and the realization that their energy is better spent elsewhere. And here's the part that's often overlooked. That silence brings them a sense of peace. For a long time, they were carrying emotional weight that didn't belong to them, trying to maintain a connection that required constant effort on their side. When they stop doing that, there's a release, a quiet relief. No more overthinking every interaction, no more rehearsing conversations in their head, no more waiting for change that never comes. Their silence is not empty, it's full of understanding. Understanding that not every relationship can be fixed. Understanding that effort has to be mutual. Understanding that self respect sometimes requires distance. And once they reach that level of understanding, they don't feel the need to explain it repeatedly. In fact, they often don't feel the need to explain it at all, because from their perspective, they already did, many times just not in silence, so the quiet becomes their boundary. A boundary that says, without words, I've done what I can, I've said what I needed to say, and now I'm choosing something different. That's why trying to break that silence without changing the underlying behavior rarely works, because the silence wasn't caused by a single moment, it was built over time. And unless that pattern is acknowledged and genuinely addressed, the empath has no reason to re engage at the same level. In the end, their silence is not about shutting someone out, it's about finally choosing themselves. It's about stepping away from a dynamic that no longer feels balanced or healthy. And once that decision is made, it tends to be lasting because for an empath, silence isn't the absence of something, it's the presence of a decision that's already been made. Emotional withdrawal rarely happens all at once, and it almost never begins at the moment people think it does. By the time distance becomes visible, fewer messages, shorter replies, less engagement, the real ending has already taken place internally. What you're seeing on the outside is simply the final stage of a much deeper, quieter process that unfolded over time. For an empath, connection isn't casual. It's layered, thoughtful, and emotionally invested. They don't just participate in relationships, they feel them, analyze them, and try to nurture them. So when something begins to feel off, they don't immediately pull away. They move closer. They ask questions, reflect, and attempt to understand what changed. They revisit conversations trying to find where the disconnect started. At first, the withdrawal is almost invisible even to them. It might look like a slight hesitation before responding or a subtle shift in tone. Maybe they share a little less about their day, or they stop bringing up certain topics that used to matter. These are not random changes. They're adjustments based on repeated experiences where openness didn't feel safe, valued, or respected. What makes this phase so easy to miss is that the empath often continues to show up. They're still present, still responsive, still trying in small ways. But internally, something has already begun to change. They are no longer engaging with the same level of emotional risk. They're testing the waters more cautiously, protecting parts of themselves that once flowed freely. This is the beginning of emotional detachment, not a complete shutdown, but a gradual retraction of energy. And it usually follows a pattern. An issue arises, they communicate it, it gets dismissed, minimized, or misunderstood. They try again, more clearly, more patiently. The result doesn't change. Each time the cycle repeats, the empath learns something. Not consciously at first, but through experience. My effort isn't leading to improvement. And that realization begins to reshape their behavior. They stop bringing up certain concerns, not because those concerns disappeared, but because they no longer believe addressing them will make a difference. They become less reactive, not because they don't feel, but because they've learned that reacting doesn't lead to resolution. Their silence starts to replace their expression, not out of indifference, but out of recognition. Recognition that they've already tried. This is where the internal ending takes place. It's not marked by a single decision or a dramatic realization. It's built through accumulation of unmet needs, unacknowledged effort, and repeated emotional strain. Over time, the empath begins to accept a difficult truth. The connection they've been trying to maintain is no longer aligned, balanced, or sustainable, and once that truth settles in, their behavior starts to reflect it. They become less invested in outcomes. They stop anticipating change. They begin redirecting their energy inward, toward themselves, their own peace, their own clarity. From the outside, this can look like they're pulling away. But from their perspective, they're not moving away from something. They're moving towards something more stable and self-respecting. What's important to understand is that by this point, the empath is no longer trying to fix the relationship. That phase has already passed. The emotional work, the thinking, the analyzing, the hoping, that all happened earlier, often without the other person fully realizing it. So when the physical or visible distance finally appears, it feels sudden to others. But to the empath, it feels like a natural next step. The decision has already been made internally. The external behavior is simply catching up to that decision. This is why attempts to reconnect at this stage often feel confusing or ineffective. Someone might notice the distance and try to address it, ask what's wrong, promise to change, or suddenly show more attention. But the empath isn't responding to a single moment anymore. They're responding to a pattern. And patterns take time to build and time to break. If the earlier stages were filled with missed opportunities to listen, understand, and adjust, then the later stages become about acceptance and release. Not because the empath wants to give up, but because they've recognized that continuing in the same dynamic will only lead to more of the same outcome. There's also a shift in emotional priority that happens here. What once felt urgent, fixing the relationship, restoring connection, becomes less important than something else, maintaining inner stability. The empath begins to value peace over possibility. And once that shift occurs, it changes how they engage with everything. They're no longer trying to prove their value. They're no longer waiting to be understood. They're no longer investing where there's no return. Instead, they're observing, evaluating, and gradually stepping back. So when you see the final stage, less communication, less presence, more distance, it's not the beginning of disconnection. It's the result of a long internal process that already reached its conclusion. And that's why it feels so definitive, because by the time the empath physically leaves or fully disengages, they've already done the emotional leaving. They've already processed the loss, adjusted their expectations, and accepted the outcome. What remains is simply the action that aligns with that internal reality. And once those two, internal and external, are aligned, the separation tends to be complete, not rushed. Not reactive, but quietly certain. Empaths are often described as endlessly patient, but that description can be misleading. Their patience is real, but it is not infinite. What makes it seem limitless is how deeply they are willing to invest before they reach their breaking point. They don't give one or two chances, they give many. And each chance isn't casual. It's backed by genuine hope that things can improve. At the beginning of any connection, an empath tends to approach people with openness. They assume good intent. They believe that misunderstandings can be resolved through communication and that most issues are temporary if both people are willing to work through them. This mindset makes them incredibly supportive, but it also means they are more likely to tolerate behavior that others might question much earlier. When something goes wrong, their first instinct isn't to walk away. It's to understand. They'll ask themselves what led to the situation. They'll consider the other person's perspective. They might even take responsibility for things that aren't entirely theirs, simply to keep the peace or move the relationship forward. And when they do speak up, it's usually done with care. They try to be clear without being confrontational, honest without being hurtful. If the issue continues, they don't immediately escalate. Instead, they give another chance, this time with slightly more awareness. They might adjust how they communicate or lower their expectations, hoping that a different approach will create a better outcome. This is where the pattern begins to form, repeated effort on their side, with inconsistent or minimal change on the other. Each chance they give carries emotional weight. It's not just a reset, it's a decision to stay, to believe, to invest again. And with every repeated disappointment, something shifts internally. Not all at once, but gradually. The optimism that once fueled their patience starts to weaken. The benefit of the doubt becomes harder to extend. Trust, which was once given freely, becomes more conditional. Still, they continue for a while. This is where people often misunderstand the empath's behavior. From the outside, it can look like they're okay with what's happening. After all, they're still there. They're still engaging. But presence doesn't always mean acceptance. In many cases, it means they're still processing, still hoping, still trying to make sense of a situation that hasn't fully settled in their mind. But there is a limit. And that limit isn't defined by a single event. It's defined by accumulation, a pattern of being unheard, a pattern of being taken for granted, a pattern of giving more than they receive. At some point, the empath stops focusing on individual incidents and starts seeing the overall dynamic. They begin to recognize that the issue isn't isolated, it's consistent. And once that realization becomes clear, it changes how they interpret everything that follows. This is the turning point. They no longer view each situation as a new opportunity to fix things. Instead, they see it as confirmation of what they've already experienced. The emotional energy they once used to repair the connection is now used to evaluate it. And this evaluation leads to a difficult but necessary conclusion. Continuing to give chances without meaningful change is no longer an act of compassion, it's an act of self-neglect. That's when their behavior begins to shift. They stop initiating the same conversations, they stop excusing the same patterns, they stop investing at the same level, not out of resentment, but out of clarity. Because they've reached a point where they understand that their effort alone cannot sustain the relationship. And more importantly, they recognize that staying in a one-sided dynamic comes at a personal cost. This is why when an empath finally decides to step back or walk away, it often feels sudden to others. There's a common reaction, "Why didn't you say something?" or "You should have given me another chance." But from the empath's perspective, those chances were already given many times. They weren't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes they were quiet, expressed through small conversations, subtle requests, or changes in tone. But they were there. And each one represented an opportunity for the dynamic to shift. When those opportunities pass without real change, the empath begins to understand that more chances won't lead to a different outcome, and that understanding is what closes the door. It's important to recognize that this decision isn't easy for them. Walking away means letting go of the effort they invested, the connection they valued, and the potential they believed in. But by the time they reach that point, staying feels more damaging than leaving, so they choose to stop, not because they stopped caring, but because they started caring about themselves too, and once that shift happens, it's difficult to reverse. Because the same awareness that led them to give so many chances is the awareness that now tells them it's time to stop. At some point in a strained connection, a quiet shift begins to take place inside an empath, a shift in priorities. What once felt most important, keeping the bond intact, fixing misunderstandings, maintaining closeness, slowly starts to lose its urgency. In its place, something else begins to rise. The need for peace, this doesn't happen suddenly. It builds over time, often without the empath fully noticing at first. In the early stages, they are still focused on the relationship. They are willing to tolerate discomfort if it means preserving the connection. They'll sit with confusion, work through tension, and invest emotional energy in trying to make things better. Their mindset is centered around growth, repair, and understanding. But when those efforts don't lead to meaningful change, the experience begins to wear on them. Not in a dramatic way, but in a steady, cumulative one. Repeated misunderstandings, unresolved issues, and emotional imbalance start to create a kind of internal noise. Constant thinking, questioning, and emotional processing that never quite settles, and that noise becomes exhausting. It's not just about what's happening externally, it's about what it's doing internally. The empath starts to feel the weight of always being the one who adjusts, explains, and absorbs. They begin to notice how much mental space the situation is taking up, how often they replay conversations, anticipate reactions, or prepare themselves emotionally for the next interaction, this is where the shift begins. They start to ask a different kind of question. Instead of, how can I fix this? It becomes, why does this keep costing me so much? That question changes everything, because now the focus is no longer on preserving the relationship at all costs. It's on understanding the cost itself, and once that cost becomes clear, it's hard to ignore. The empath begins to recognize that the connection as it currently exists is not just imperfect, it's draining. Not because conflict exists, but because the effort to manage that conflict is one-sided. They see that they are consistently the one regulating the emotional climate, trying to maintain balance, and preventing things from falling apart. And eventually, they reach a point where they realize this is not sustainable. At the same time, they begin to experience brief moments of what it feels like to step back. Maybe they take a little space intentionally or unintentionally. Maybe they stop engaging in a particular conversation, or they choose not to respond right away. And in those moments, something unexpected happens. They feel relief, a sense of quiet, a reduction in mental clutter, a break from the constant emotional effort. It's subtle, but it's powerful. Because for the first time, they're not managing the relationship, they're simply existing without its pressure. And that experience introduces a new possibility. What if this peace could be consistent? From that point on, their perspective begins to shift more rapidly. They start to value that calm feeling more than the connection that disrupts it. Not because the connection doesn't matter, but because the cost of maintaining it has become too high. They begin to see that peace isn't something they should have to earn after conflict. It's something they can choose by changing their environment. This realization doesn't make them cold or detached. It makes them clear they're no longer willing to trade their internal stability for external connection. They're no longer interested in dynamics that require constant emotional labor just to feel okay. And they begin to understand that choosing peace is not selfish, it's necessary. As this clarity grows, their behavior naturally follows. They stop engaging in conversations that feel repetitive or draining. They stop trying to correct patterns that haven't changed. They stop investing energy in situations that consistently take more than they give. Instead, they redirect that energy inward. They focus on their own well-being, their own clarity, their own sense of balance. And as they do, the contrast becomes even more obvious. The difference between how they feel within the strained connection and how they feel outside of it becomes too significant to ignore. That's when the decision solidifies. Peace is no longer a temporary break. It becomes the priority, and once that priority is established, the empath doesn't feel the same pull to return to what once was. Not because they've forgotten the connection, but because they now understand what it costs them. This is why, when an empath chooses silence or distance, it often feels so final. It's not just about leaving a person or a situation, it's about moving toward a different standard of living, one where emotional stability is protected, not negotiated. And importantly, this choice is not driven by anger or resentment, it's driven by alignment. They are aligning their external choices with their internal needs. They are choosing environments, interactions, and relationships that support their sense of calm rather than challenge it constantly. And once they've experienced what that alignment feels like, it becomes very difficult to accept anything less. So when you see an empath step back and choose silence, it's not because they've stopped caring. It's because they've started caring about something deeper, their peace. And once peace becomes more valuable than the connection itself, the decision to walk away doesn't feel like a loss. It feels like a return to themselves. As closing thought, outro. So remember this clearly. When an empath goes quiet, it's not confusion, it's not a mood, and it's definitely not a game. It's clarity, clarity that they've given enough, clarity that they've explained enough, clarity that they can no longer sacrifice their peace just to keep a connection alive. because at some point, even the most understanding person realizes something powerful. Asterisk love should not feel like constant exhaustion, care should not feel one sided, and connection should not cost your inner peace. And once that realization settles in, something shifts permanently. The empath stops chasing, stops explaining, stops trying to fix what keeps breaking them, and instead they choose silence not as revenge, not as punishment, but as protection. So if you ever find yourself in that silence, either giving it or receiving it, understand what it truly means. Asterisk something important wasn't valued until it was gone. And by then, the empath has already moved on, quietly, completely, and for good.